Well, good evening, folks. My name is Christina Sid, and I'm the Director of Programs at the High Desert Museum. The High Desert Museum sits in and shares the stories of what was, is, and always will be the Indigenous Plateau. We're in the homeland of the Warm Springs, Wasco, and Paiute tribes, known today as the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. This land has long been a dynamic crossroads, a place where many Indigenous people traveled, gathered, and traded. We extend our respect and gratitude to the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs and all of the Native communities who have lived here for thousands of generations and continue to thrive here today. We recognize the strength, resilience, and sovereignty of the Warm Springs, Wasco, and Paiute people, as well as Native people throughout the Indigenous Plateau, who have long been and continue to be stewards of this land. We are honored to collaborate with the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs and tribes throughout the plateau to share the stories and knowledge of the Indigenous Plateau. For more than a decade, Portland General Electric and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs have been generating emissions-free electricity at the Pelton Round Butte Hydropower project in Central Oregon. This project is also the site of an ambitious effort to reintroduce sustainable runs of salmon and steelhead to the Deschutes River. Tonight, we'll learn more about this project from Megan Hill, Natural Resource Manager for the Portland General Electric. Jim Mannion, General Manager of the Warm Springs Power Enterprises, was originally scheduled to co-lead the discussion, but he has a conflict and is now unable to attend. We are pleased to host this event in partnership with PGE Project Zero and with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. The mission of PGE Project Zero is to empower the next generation to create a cleaner and greener world. PGE Project Zero launched in 2020 with a focus on environmental stewardship, workforce development in the green jobs economy, and K-12 education focusing on climate change literacy. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Megan Hill is the Natural Resource Manager for PGE at the Pelton Round Butte Hydroelectric Project on the Deschutes River. Megan has over 15 years of experience in fisheries, including employment in academia, a federal agency, and PGE. She has a BA in Biology and Environmental Studies from Knox College and an MS in Environmental Science from Washington State University and postgraduate fisheries work at the University of Georgia. When not working, Megan enjoys exploring Central Oregon outdoors with her husband, young kids, and 8-month-old pandemic puppy. I'm going to turn it over now to Megan, and I will say at the end of the program, there will be a time for question and answers. You'll be able to add your questions to the Q&A portion of the Zoom screen, and I'll turn it over to Megan. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, and thanks to everyone for showing up this evening. As Christina mentioned, I was planning to do this presentation with Jim Mannion, who is the General Manager with Warm Springs Power, because this project is co-owned by Portland General Electric and the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. And unfortunately, he was unable to join at the last minute. So I am going to muddle through. So we kind of outlined this presentation to hopefully answer, the big questions about the project, kind of who we are, where we're at, what we're doing, kind of what the time scale is, a little bit of the history, how we like to work, and then why are we going about this effort to reintroduce fish. And so we'll start, with the easy one. Where are we? So for those of you who might be calling in from other locations, we are in Central Oregon on the Deschutes River. The project is located most closely to the town of Madras or Warm Springs, and we're about 100 miles upstream of the confluence with the Columbia River. Again, on the Deschutes River, we are a 3-dam project. The uppermost dam, Round Butte Dam, will be kind of the main focus of today's talk. It creates Lake Billy Chinook, which is a reservoir that's very complex in that it is formed by the coming together of 3 rivers. So the Metolius River, the Deschutes River, and the Crooked River kind of all coming together. It's a large reservoir. It's a deep reservoir, exceeding 400 feet depth in some places. Downstream of Round Butte Dam, we have Pelton Dam, and between those two projects, we have Lake Tustis, which is another reservoir that's popular with recreation. There's a couple campgrounds on the reservoir, and it's much smaller, about 7 miles in length. And then one dam downstream of that, we have the re-regulating dam. There's a kind of very small reservoir in between those two. It's not open to public use, so there's no recreation on that reservoir. Its main function is to allow us to operate as a run-of-the-river project. And so what I mean by that is we don't fluctuate flow in the lower river. We send downstream the same amount as the inflow, the amount of water coming into the project. And it's this reservoir here in this lowermost dam that allows us to do that. So kind of moving on, we noticed in the registration that there's some people kind of from potentially not in the Pacific Northwest. And so I thought it would be helpful to just kind of recap really quick the basics in salmon biology, because it's really critical to understand kind of the historical impacts of dams and also what we're trying to do with reintroduction and restoration efforts. So salmon are anadromous, which means they spend part of their life in freshwater and part of their life in saltwater. So here the freshwater is where salmon lay their eggs. Those eggs hatch and grow up till eventually they get to be smolts, which are typically about 6 to 8 inches. And a smolt is a fish that's undergone the physiological changes it needs to tolerate saltwater. And so after it's kind of, or in the midst of undergoing those changes, it starts migrating downstream to the estuary and to the ocean. Then fish spend a couple years in the ocean. There's a lot of variability depending on salmon species and depending on basin. Here in the Deschutes, typically fish will spend 2 years in the ocean. Then after they've been in the ocean for a couple of years, eating and growing, they come back to us to freshwater as a fish that's ready to spawn and lay their eggs in the creeks and rivers here. The main impacts of dams historically have been that we end up kind of blocking that life cycle. So smolts are no longer able to make it to the ocean, and then those adults are no longer able to make it back to spawn. And so generally, especially for a species like Chinook salmon, you end up extirpating or losing that population of fish from the environment because they just can't continue to live out their whole life cycle. So with that, I'm going to kind of get more specific and talk about, what this all means on the Deschutes River. So these projects were built, these dams were built in the 1950s and 1960s. And interestingly, at the time of their construction, fish passage was a concern, and they did include fish passage facilities. And so on the left here, kind of on the side of the river, you can see a ladder. That's a fish ladder. So that's the original fish ladder that was constructed in the 50s. At the time of construction, it was the longest fish ladder in the world. And it was a fairly ingenious system. The fish ladder went for a couple miles. Fish then were released into that middle reservoir, Lake Tustis. Fish swam through Lake Tustis to the base of Round Butte Dam. And so this is the uppermost dam. Fish would jump into kind of a holding area at the base of the dam. They would be loaded into a trolley, a water-filled trolley. There was a cable system that went up to this tower here on the left of the picture. So it was like kind of a fish gondola. It went up to there and then kind of lowered that bucket into the water, and gates opened and the fish could swim away. Probably not how we would build things today, but it worked. Fish were able to make that journey as returning adults. What didn't work so well is juveniles getting out of the upper basin. And so, we had fish coming down from the Metolius and Deschutes and Crooked historically, and they would come down to Lake Billy Chinook to Round Butte Dam, and there was a fish collection facility called a gulper over here on the left-hand side. And it had some pumped attraction, but it was kind of stuck over in the corner and it didn't have a lot of attraction. The majority of the flow was, of course, going downstream through the turbine. And that outflow was over here by this other tower at about 273 feet of depth. And these fish are typically in the top 30 or so feet. And so you had a situation where most of your currents were way too deep for fish to detect them. And the little attraction you had was over in the corner. And so pretty quickly, fish passage at Round Butte Dam was declared a failure. And so Portland General Electric and the tribes went to hatchery mitigation. And so we began to release hatchery and steelhead Chinook, or hatchery steelhead and Chinook downstream of the dams to kind of mitigate for the loss of habitat upstream. And so for the 45 years or so, that was the state of things. We lost Chinook, steelhead, and sockeye to 250 stream miles upstream of the dams, and we had hatchery releases and a hatchery fishery downstream of the dam. Come the late 90s, early 2000s, our license from FERC, the Federal Energy Regulating Commission, was due to expire. And so we have to have a license from FERC in order to generate power. And so we started the process of relicensing in order to get a new license to allow us to operate into the future. And so to do that, we went through a collaborative process to agree with everybody in the basin kind of what would the terms be for us to continue to operate the license. And that culminated in 2004 with a settlement agreement, which had 22 parties. So it had state agencies like ODFW and DEQ, federal agencies like the Forest Service, NOAA Fisheries, tribal agencies, of course, so the Branch of Natural Resources, as well as the Water Control Board. We also had the local cities and counties, so Redmond, Bend, Madras, as well as Jefferson and Deschutes counties, and then NGO groups, Native Fish Society, American Rivers, for example. So 22 fairly diverse groups who kind of self-selected that they wanted to be a part of this process and wanted to shape what the future would look like at Pelton Round Butte. So that was agreed to in 2004. That settlement agreement was then incorporated into the license, which we got in 2005. So that settlement agreement is 597 pages, lots of details, lots of requirements, but I kind of boil them down into these four very high-level goals. We want to continue to generate power at the facility, as that's sort of the main function of these dams. Provide recreational opportunities around the project. The big two are returning sustainable, harvestable runs of Chinooks, steelhead, and sockeye to that upper basin. And then finally, and this is a big bucket, restore the Deschutes watershed to a more natural state. And so I'm going to kind of walk through each of those and really focus on the last two, talking about restoration and reintroduction. But I do want to mention, of course, the hydropower side of things because that is key to why we're here. And I think it's important also to understand the reintroduction, that this is a large hydro facility. So we have a capacity of approximately 500 megawatts. And we serve about 150,000 homes with this project. So it's the second largest hydro project entirely in the state of Oregon. And these are high head dams. So Round Butte Dam is 440 feet high. And so that kind of creates challenges when we start to think about fish passage. There are 46 of us that work on the hydro facility itself. 12 of us are on the biological side and the compliance side of things, and then the other folks are making the electricity and making sure everything is operating well and safe. And because of everything I'm going to kind of talk about this evening, we are certified as low impact hydro by the Low Impact Hydro Institute. So as I mentioned, one of our goals is related to recreation opportunities. We maintain 13 different recreation facilities that range from, quarter-mile trails that go out to kind of viewpoints to full service campgrounds. If you've heard of Pelton Park, that is a PGE campground on Lake Semtestus, which is pretty popular and is part of our agreement to operate the facility. Another cool thing, recreation-wise, is this little girl here has caught and kept legally a bull trout in Lake Billy Chinook. And so bull trout are listed as threatened on the endangered species list, but they're doing really well in the Metolius Basin, so much so that you can legally catch and harvest one bull trout over 26 inches. And so that's really good to see. That's in large part due to our good, high quality water in the Metolius and ample habitat in Lake Billy Chinook. So if you haven't checked out the reservoirs, they're a beautiful place to spend a day or weekend. So now kind of getting into the meat of things and talking about reintroduction and restoration. So as I mentioned, we went 45 years without having salmon and steelhead upstream of the project. And so we had to start somewhere. This wasn't a situation where we could just install fish passage and let them come and it would happen on its own. We had to reintroduce fish. And so to do that, we used Round Butte Hatchery, which is based on a local Deschutes stock of fish. And we started out the program doing fry releases. And so fry are the little babies. They're 1.5 inches long. And basically we put them in bags of water with air, just like if you go to an aquarium store and get fish. And then we would backpack those or bucket them out into the stream and release them in slow water habitat like this high schooler is doing here. And it was a big community effort, largely led by Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We had lots of volunteers come out, and we had a lot of fun doing that. But at the same time we were doing the fry releases, we had a smaller smolt release program. And so smolts are the fish that are about 6 to 8 inches. Those, again, are fish that should be spending a couple weeks in freshwater and then migrating out towards the ocean. And so we compared kind of our success rate with these fry and these smolts and found over time that the smolts were outperforming the fry. And so we've now transitioned to an entirely smolt-based program. And so every year we introduce 100,000 Chinook and 100,000 steelhead fry into the habitats upstream of the dam. The next thing that happens is those fish hopefully spend a couple weeks in the stream and then start to swim downstream towards the ocean. So they enter Lake Billy Chinook, hopefully make it down to the dam itself and encounter the selective water withdrawal or fish passage system or fish tower, SWW. It goes by a number of names. This is a key part of the license that we constructed in 2010, and it has two main functions. One is fish passage and the other is temperature management. How it works kind of at a high level is that during the spring months when these fish are migrating, it allows us to draw up to 6,000 CFS, so the flow of the entire Deschutes River through the fish collection entrances at the surface. And so remember, historically, the only water leaving the dams was at 247 feet of depth. And so that didn't provide good attraction, where when we draw it off the surface, we are able to provide currents that fish can feel. The water temperature management piece that I'm going to go into a little more later is we're able to do that because we kept that old entrance at the deep depths. And as things progress in the season, we're able to blend, a certain percentage of bottom and a certain percentage of top water in order to meet our temperature targets. So again, this was constructed in 2010. We've been collecting fish ever since. Total, we've collected a little over 1.5 million fish through this facility. And I'm going to play a video that I hope works for y'all and kind of talk over the top of it to give you a little better feel for kind of what happens when the fish encounter the facility. So we're kind of panning out, looking up the reservoir. Over here, we're seeing the Crooked and Deschutes, and just out of view or up here is the Metolius. Fish can come in one of these two entrances that are 40 by 60 feet. They narrow up in the back, and as they narrow up, flow increases, and eventually it gets fast enough that fish can't swim back out, and so then they're captured. They kind of go back to this facility. Large fish end up here, and the smaller smolts go through this pipe. In these boxes are two pit tag readers, and those let us study the fish, figure out where fish are coming from, how many are making it, how quick they're making it. Big fish go over bars, little fish go through the bars. We want to keep our big fish separate from our little fish, otherwise we end up with lots of really big fish because our big fish eat our little ones. Kate's crowding the day's catch over here, or a portion of the catch over here, to this lift basket, which she raised up, and then fish get kind of pushed into this building here where we count and mark the whole catch. And so this is a little bit of a unique situation in that we're required to mark every fish that comes through our facility so that only fish that originated above the dam can go back upstream. And that's just a precaution to make sure that we don't accidentally introduce disease into an area that's been sheltered from a lot of fish diseases for, half a century. So Drew here is putting a pit tag in the fish. That's a little microchip that's individually coded and can be picked up at Bonneville Dam and in the estuary and give us information about how well fish are surviving in the lower Deschutes and to the Columbia. And so we do this every day pretty much, aside from a short maintenance shutdown once a year. And in a given day, we can move up to 14,000 fish through the facility. Once we've gone through the day's catch, fish are loaded onto trucks. They're then trucked around all three dams and released into the lower Deschutes River. So hopefully that video gave you a little more feel for what this looks like. So after fish go to the lower Deschutes, they migrate downstream through the Columbia into the ocean, typically spend 2 years in the ocean, and then hopefully come back to us as adults. And so we have had adults returning for the past several years. We have been able to document adult Chinook and steelhead and sockeye spawning, and we've documented spawning in all of the tributaries. Currently, today, we have 66 Chinook above the project, finding mates and pairing up, and getting ready to spawn this probably August and September. So that's super exciting. Those are fish that weren't here for, better part of 5 decades. However, 64 isn't our end goal by any means. Our goal is to get 10 times that, to be much closer to returns of 500 to 1,000 fish per species per year. And so we're doing a lot of work with our partners to accelerate our progress on reintroduction and also to just get more adults back. And so I'll talk about some of our efforts to improve our numbers and improve the speed at which we're working towards the end of the presentation. But overall, it's really cool to see these fish coming back. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about our habitat restoration. And most of the ways that we do this is through the Pelton Fund. And so I think the license was really smart in recognizing that fish passage is key, but it's not going to solve the problem by itself. And you're not going to be able to reintroduce runs with fish passage alone. You need to have good, high quality habitat for fish to spawn in and for fish to grow and rear in. And so the license kind of set up a grant program where PGE and the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs contribute $26 million to on the ground restoration in the Deschutes Basin, specifically with the goal of improving reintroduction success. And so I can't go through kind of all the details, but I've kind of gone through and chosen the big buckets that we tend to work in and give an example project for each of those. So the first is fish passage. So we're working at a 440-foot big hydro dam there are a lot of other smaller barriers to fish passage in the basin. This is one of them. This was a dam located on the Crooked River that really didn't have a whole lot of purpose anymore. And so we worked with the Crooked River Watershed Council to provide funding to remove this barrier. And removal of that barrier was able to open up 12 miles of habitat upstream for not only the anadromous fish that we're trying to reintroduce, but also resident rainbow to be able to move around in that important section of river. This is one of 18 now fish passage projects that we've funded through the Pelton Fund. Another thing that the fund is used for is to acquire and protect land for the long term. And so this is primarily done through helping provide funding to the Deschutes Land Trust. This is probably my favorite project recently. This is the Pride Ranch in Jefferson County, kind of nearest, I would say, Madras. This is an incredibly important, it's on Trout Creek, which is an incredibly important system for steelhead. And steelhead in the lower river are, again, listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. And so they need habitat. And this habitat in particular, this 11 miles, much of it had gone through a restoration project by ODFW, and compared to other areas, it's in really good shape. And so the fact that it is now being protected for the long term, I think is really important. Not to mention the upland areas that are, of course, also important to aquatic and other life. Another area that we work in is protecting riparian areas, planting. So some of these restoration projects happen and then native vegetation is planted following. And we also do a lot of the glamorous work of fence repair in order to keep livestock out of creeks. Another kind of key area of work for the Pelton Fund has to do with water. And water, of course, is the key to fish habitat. And here in the high desert, it is of limited supply. And so one of the things that we help fund, mainly working through the Deschutes River Conservancy, are ways to get more water in stream. And so this is just one example of the many creative ways people are working on that, which is piping. And so traditionally, water's been conveyed miles using open canals. And so you have a situation where you have evaporation happening and you're losing water, and you have seepage happening and you're losing water. And so you end up having to transport more water than you really need, because not all of that water is going to make it to the end of the canal. And so if you can pipe that, you're able to basically gain a lot of efficiency. You don't need to transport as much water, and that savings can then be converted into in-stream rights to, or in-stream water rights that can be protected long-term for fish and wildlife. And I think, you know, working in these ways where they're collaborative and you're gaining efficiencies to help fish is really, really important, especially when we have limited supply of water. The next, you know, big area of work is in-stream habitat. And so this is work to do work in the stream to make habitat better. And a big way that we do that in Central Oregon is by adding wood back in stream. And so wood was removed from our systems for various reasons: logging, channelization, and now, you know, increasingly we're recognizing how important that wood is for fish habitat, for forming pools. And so we helped fund efforts to put it back. And this is a really cool project that the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs did on the Warm Springs River, where they helicoptered in 900 trees in like 3 days. And it was a really impressive effort. And they're continuing that work today. And I had to say something about beavers, because we are here today in part because of our sponsorship of the beaver exhibit at the High Desert Museum, which is really good. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I took my kids and they loved the prehistoric beaver best of all. But you know, beavers do impact the way we're working, and we're learning from beavers. So This is an actual beaver from Camp Polk. This is the video that the Land Trust took of a beaver doing a very good job of building a beaver dam and creating this nice pool habitat for fish upstream. We've also been, experimenting with what's called a beaver dam analog. And so this is just a human-built beaver dam. The Upper Deschutes Watershed Council and the Land Trust have been building these on properties in Whitechoose Creek to, give the beavers a hand and create some of these pool habitats. And it's been cool to see the beavers add to them and then build their own dams as well. So beavers are super helpful in creating really important habitat for these fish. And, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of our efforts to protect wildlife as well. A piece of our effort is to mitigate for the fact that we did lose habitat, we inundated habitat when the reservoirs were constructed. And so we protect habitat in the surrounding areas. We manage a little over 12,000 acres for mainly mule deer protection. And that management includes weed treatments, closing off recreational roads that are disturbing their habitat, juniper treatments to kind of open up the canopy and provide better forage for the deer. And this is really important work. Mule deer are declining in the area, and so we want to continue to protect them. And so now I'm going to switch gear from kind of talking about the physical habitat to talking about something that's a little harder to wrap your head around sometimes, which is restoration of stream temperatures downstream of Round Butte. And so this is my only graph, which I'm pretty proud of as a scientist, but I had to get one in here. This is a temperature graph of the lower Deschutes River. And this is the actual data of what the lower Deschutes near Madras was in the year 1953. So this isn't modeled, this is stream temperature data. And what you can see is that, we had peak temperatures in July timeframe. So when you'd kind of expect, because it's the hottest season of the year. And so when we built the dams, we changed that. And so the red line is now what the temperature on average were like post dam construction. And what you can see is that we typically had cooler springs and warmer kind of late summers and falls. And so the reason for that is, again, it's that historically deep water withdrawal. So because our outlet was at 200 some feet, the cold water sunk because it was more dense, and that's what we sent downstream. And then as the kind of season progressed, we ran out of that cold water store and our water was artificially warm. And so one of the goals of the new license was to change this back. So to shift this curve to look more like it looked historically. And I think, I like to pause here and explain that desire to shift back to what it was like before the dams were here isn't an academic one. So it wasn't just the desire to make temperatures look more like they looked in the 50s. It was because of these fish. It was because mainly of fall Chinook. And so fall Chinook are historically extremely important to the tribes as a food source, and they're extremely important to the ecosystem of the lower Deschutes. When we think about the biomass of the lower Deschutes River, fall Chinook are the dominant fish. So we can have runs of up to 20,000 fall Chinook. Recently, within the last 10 years, we've had numbers like that. And this is an entirely native, non-hatchery fish that just run in huge numbers. And those fish bring with them ocean nutrients, and they bring a tremendous amount of food. They lay eggs, bugs can eat the eggs, other animals can feast on their carcasses and things. So hugely important. And the concern with this new temperature regime is that those fish were hatching in the spring. It was artificially cold, and so they weren't able to grow as big. So they were entering the ocean at a smaller size. And we know from a lot of studies elsewhere that fish that enter the ocean smaller just don't survive as well. And then there was also concerns that when these fish were returning and getting ready to spawn in kind of the October, November timeframe, that the water was warmer than it would have been historically So again, the license goal is shift that back to look more like it would look without the dam. And so that's what we do. Every day during the spring, summer, and fall, we have a water quality specialist who runs a regression equation that takes into account the temperature of the tributaries coming into the reservoir and air temperature, and generates a temperature target of what the lower Deschutes would be if the dams and the reservoirs weren't there. And so that becomes what we attempt to achieve. So if you look at, mid-May here, we are trying to get the lower Deschutes to be about 12 degrees Celsius. And so to do that, we take a blend of the surface water and the bottom water. And so, for example, right now we're blending 15% bottom water and 85% surface water to meet our temperature goals. And so we've done a good job. We have shifted back to look where our peak temperatures are in July, our springs are warmer, and our falls are cooler. That being said, this shift is a big one that had to do with temperatures, and we started to hear concerns pretty early on that this was causing unanticipated consequences beyond temperature in the lower Deschutes River, and it was affecting fisheries, affecting macroinvertebrates, and affecting algae. And so we got together with the agencies and discussed, where do we have good data? Where are there data gaps? And what we kind of found through that process is that ODFW and the tribes had decent data on fisheries. We had pretty good data on invertebrates, but we didn't have great data on algae or nutrients. And so we commissioned a water quality study to get that data, as well as kind of the larger suite of water quality parameters. We collected data for 2.5 years, which is critical because we got a drought year in there and we got a high flow year in there. And we collected data coming into the reservoirs, in the reservoirs, and then the entire 100-mile section of the lower Deschutes. This culminated in approximately a 500-page report. And so I'm going to give you the super high level, but you can find it on our website if you're interested in more of the nuances. What we found is that when we look at the basin holistically, the way we're operating the project is a good balance of reservoir needs, of lower river needs, and of fisheries. We looked at modeling different solutions to potentially improve lower river water quality. And generally speaking, those all had big trade-offs. So there was no kind of one silver bullet solution. However, we also found that, the way water was moving downstream post SWW, we were sending more nutrient-rich Crooked River water to the lower river at a time when algae could take advantage of it and grow. And so lately, we have been working to prioritize work in the Crooked. And so PGE and the tribes have helped fund the Crooked River Water Quality Partnership, which is an effort by irrigation districts and the county and the Crooked River Watershed Council to come together and put together a strategic action plan around nutrient reduction. And we've also directed our latest round of Pelton funding to the Crooked River. And so we're trying to, again, kind of find solutions to the problem, kind of where it's occurring, as opposed to sort of a temporary solution right where we're conveying the water. So more work to be done on this, of course, but the study provided us a lot of insights into what's happening with water quality. And so that kind of segues into, that's sort of what we're doing, a little bit about how we like to work. Our license, of course, is our guiding document, and it talks about what we have to do, but it's also really pretty clear in how we need to go about doing this work. The license is based on science and also collaboration. And so we continuously have involvement of the agencies and environmental organizations that signed on to the settlement agreement. We had a fish committee meeting this morning, and we also go through a process where we have to show FERC how we're involving those stakeholders. And then, the license understood when they were writing it back in the late 90s that they couldn't perfectly predict 2020. And so it is based on adaptive management. And so my next couple slides before I close out are going to kind of explain a couple examples. I think this is the most exciting part of how we are learning and adapting and hopefully making good strides toward getting more of those fish back. So, again, I guess collaboration is key. We collaborate both kind of with our agencies on site, but we also look outside of the basin. So this is a picture of our fish committee, the agencies that guide our decision making. We all went on a tour to the Lewis River to visit Pacific Core's SWIFT project to kind of learn about their reintroduction program, learn what was working well for them, and hopefully get good ideas. And so we try to collaborate on multiple levels because I just think you get better solutions that way. An example of doing that here in the Deschutes is this effort to acclimate fish. And so as you may remember, I talked about we do smolt releases. And so when we started that program, we would take the fish from the hatchery when they're 6 to 8 inches long, load them on trucks, and then release them directly into the river. And what we found is that those fish would only spend a couple hours, at most a couple days in the creek before they shot out of there and were headed downstream. And so we got concerned that that wasn't enough time for those fish to imprint on the water. And the concern around if they're not imprinting is that they're not going to know how to make it back as adults. And so we looked again to what other folks are doing, in particular the Confederated tribes work in the Hood River, and found that people were having a lot of success with acclimation. And so acclimation is just holding fish on river water for 2 to 3 weeks prior to release, and so that they really can imprint. And so we did a trial kind of study of this in 2017, and we were happy to see that fish that were acclimated made it to the collection facility as juveniles at much higher rates than fish that were just released out of the back of the truck. And so we've been slowly increasing the percentage of fish that we've acclimated so that this year we met our ultimate goal of 100,000 Chinook, 100,000 steelhead, all fish were acclimated. And this has just been a fun effort, super, lots of people coming together to make it happen. So here in the lower left is a tank that's on the land trust property at Camp Polk. This is kind of the industrial acclimation. It's a tank that the tribes lent us from the Hood River. It can hold about 25,000 fish, and just river waters run through it. We also have these lower tech solutions, which are just hardware cloth and 2x4s made of pens and set them in the creek, and water flows through, and fish are able to get in water that way. And then we've also kind of partnered with ODFW and the city of Prineville to acclimate fish in net pens, so floating net pens in the kids' fishing ponds in those two areas. And so we're doing this acclimation in March before they're open for fishing. And so it's a nice double use of that space. The fishing ponds provide a very safe, protected location. And it's just been fun to kind of have everybody coming together with really creative solutions to figure out how to get these fish acclimated. And we're really hopeful that, again, these fish that are now out in the ocean for 2 years will have a better time and more luck coming back to us in the Deschutes in 2023. And then finally, that's kind of having to do with the fish release side of things. Once fish come to the SWW, we also look at ways to reduce stress for those fish, and how we release them into the lower Deschutes. And so when we first started the process in 2010, our operations would be, we'd come up in the morning, we would work through all the fish, we would load them on the trucks, we would truck them to lower Deschutes, and we'd release them around lunchtime. But we started to notice that when we kind of came through the gate and turned on our backup beeper, that the osprey and mergansers and other predators in the area we're keying into our food delivery system, and we're starting to eat our fish. And that does not bode well for adults coming back. And so we did a study where we tagged fish and released them during the day, and we tagged fish and released them during the night, and we compared which fish survived better to the Columbia, and found that night released fish make it at much higher rates. And so we shifted our operations. We hired another crew to come in at night, truck the fish, and release them into the lower Deschutes. We did that for about 4 years, and it worked, but it wasn't ideal. Fish are still going directly from the truck to the river. We were hiring a second crew. They were doing this work at dark, which is not as safe. And so we wanted a better solution. And so again, we looked at what other people are doing, and Baker Project in Washington, as well as Swift, had stress relief ponds. And so what this is where you take fish, you truck them, you release them into a pond or a tank, and let them just decompress. Their stress hormones go down. And then when they're ready, they can volitionally choose to swim out of the pond, or you can drain the pond. And so this solved a few problems for us. One is we got away from that nighttime work, so it's safer for the folks doing the job. And then secondly, it's better for the fish because they get that opportunity to relax after going on the truck ride. So we just commissioned this 2 weeks ago. So we're really excited about it. And again, the tricky thing is we've made these efforts to improve our adult returns, but now we're kind of in this waiting game where we sent those fish off to the ocean, and now we wait 2 years to see whether or not these changes are making big impacts. And so, that's kind of where I want to leave it. We're making a lot of good changes. We have a really firm foundation for where we want to go and the things that we think we can do to improve adult return rates. It is a slow process, and it's slow in part because of the life cycle of these fish, and the fact that we do have this 2-year kind of lapse, I guess, in terms of seeing the results of the work we're doing. And while they're out in the ocean, that's kind of out of our control. And some years we have good ocean conditions, and some years we have bad ocean conditions, and all that affects the number of fish that we get back. But I think it's important to kind of end with why we're doing this. We're doing this to get sustainable and harvestable runs of fish back. If Jim were here with me today, he would talk about, our goal isn't to get sort of artifacts of the past. Like, it is important to the tribes to get fish back to the levels that we can have fisheries again in those historic habitats. And I'm certainly excited to see, be able to take my kids out to the stream and see these fish in good numbers. I've gotten to go out and snorkel next to, these sockeye here, and it's really something else to be able to see them and know that we're bringing them back slowly, but we are getting there. So with that, I think we've got a few minutes for questions if we have any.
We do. Thank you so much, Megan. I really appreciate hearing about the collaboration among different organizations, the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs, and then also hearing, I think one of the themes that I heard throughout the presentation was thinking about continuous improvement and problem solving and looking at data and science and collaborating with folks about how can we improve upon the work that you all are doing. So I really appreciate that, and seeing historical images too of the fish slaughter was really interesting. One of the questions that I'd love to hear your perspective on is to think about, to learn more about how has climate change impacted any of your management approaches. I think that's probably a big question, but just would love to know more about that.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. Like that was the subject of our fish committee meeting today. Climate change is impacting us like it is everywhere else. Probably a little less, I guess, because we do have so many springs in Central Oregon that do help provide a little bit of a buffer. But one of the pieces of the water quality study was to do modeling to look at kind of, what are we going to see in the future? And certainly we're already seeing some of those impacts in terms of warming temperatures, warming stream temperatures, and have concerns about what that means for fish. And I think we have this year in particular with the drought conditions been concerned, but we're watching it. We have a long-term low flow trigger plan, so we look every year at what we're seeing for flows, so that we can hopefully deal with that going forward. But it's certainly a big question, one that we're watching and trying to figure out how to deal with best.
Yeah, well, thank you. Some of the other, looking to some of the questions that have come along, can you talk about the estimated historical numbers of salmon, or I'm sorry, the question is, what was the estimated historical numbers of salmon, steelhead returning to the Deschutes Basin?
Yeah, so it varies a little bit for each species, and the data isn't perfect, of course, because it's been a long time, and we've had impacts on the land for forever. But the Crooked River was already pretty impacted as early as the 1800s, and so the best data we have and kind of our vision for what we're trying to restore runs at about 1,000 fish per species per year. And so that's sort of our best estimate for what would have been above the project and what the habitat could support.
Great, thank you. Another question is, in thinking about the re-regulating dam, to what specific flow does this final dam restore flow? What is the flow to which it is matched?
Yeah, so the re-regulating dam, what we do is we calculate the inflow. So basically it's a sum of the Deschutes, the Crooked, and the Metolius rivers coming into Lake Billy Chinook, and then we match that flow in the lower Deschutes. And so on a given day, like today, there's probably 4,000 CFS coming into the reservoir, and so there needs to be 4,000 CFS coming out. And there is a little bit of play there. We have to be within 10% of inflow, and so there sometimes it's a little much, sometimes a little lower, but for the most part, it's very steady. And so yeah, it's a daily calculation to match what's coming into the reservoirs.
Great, thank you. And one more question. I think the question is, how does the work with this dam kind of compare to the Snake River low dam removal? And maybe it's talking more, if you know more about that.
So trying to think, it's not directly comparable. So we're working on reintroduction here. This is much closer to the ocean compared to the Snake River dams. So I'm not quite sure how to answer that, aside from they're very different systems. Kind of each dam has its own particulars as to how it's providing hydropower, how it's whether or not restoration can happen, reintroduction can happen, if anadromous fish species. So it's really hard to get into kind of a dam to dam comparison, because they all have such particular circumstances about them.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Megan, so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I also really appreciate highlighting the beaver, just for folks to know that the High Desert Museum does right now have an exhibit up through October 3rd called Damn It, Beavers and Us, and really does talk about the importance of water and the importance of beaver in climate change mitigation, which are some of the things that we've talked about today. But I really appreciate your time and knowledge, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
And everyone, thanks for being here, and have a great day. And we will be posting, this has been recorded and will be posted on YouTube, and we'll share the link in case you want to share this with anyone in your social groups. Wonderful. Well, thanks everybody, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.